Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Frames of Space. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. I don't have a guest lined up for this episode, so I thought I might fill the void with some bonus content. So I guess I would start by spending at least a little bit of time explaining the meaning for the name of this podcast, because I've been publishing for episodes and months now, but I don't think I've actually sat down and given you a proper explanation for why the podcast title is Frames of Space. So the explanation is that there's tons and tons of negative space around wonky political discussions nowadays. There's so much politics to keep up with that if you're just some average person, it can feel hard to understand what to listen to or even how to understand all the stuff that people are talking about. My goal with this podcast is essentially to build intellectual scaffolding around all of that. I want my podcast to talk about politics, but talk about it in a way that is at the intersection between being both accessible and nuanced at the same time. And I'm trying to target a wide variety of audience members. I'm trying to target both political hobbyists that consume hours and hours of political content in their free time, and people who don't follow politics that much, but wish that there was a way that they could find extremely nuanced and complex deep dives while still being able to at least mostly keep up with what is being discussed. There's one portion of bonus content later on where one of the guests said that they were trying to collapse a broad societal concept into something explainable. And I realized that that is a lot of what I am trying to do with this podcast. Take very broad concepts, social concepts, economic concepts, societal concepts as a whole, and find ways to collapse those broad concepts into something explainable without losing any of the nuance or complexity that is necessary to discuss. Yeah, so thank you for listening to me monologue for a few minutes about the name of this podcast, and I now return you all to our usual scheduled programming. Have you ever watched a movie you really enjoyed and then went home and then stopped thinking about it, and then later on watched some deleted scenes in the movie that you also really enjoyed? And that doesn't necessarily mean that those deleted scenes needed to make it in the movie. Sometimes it didn't really fit the pacing. Sometimes there was one aspect of it that sort of turned your attention away, or at least it would have done so if it was in the movie. But like those deleted scenes on their own were still very interesting and thought-provoking. That is the goal of what I am trying to do with this episode. You see, I guess I have a little bit of a backlog of content from previous episodes that I decided to cut. To help with the pacing, maybe I thought that it would be more streamlined or more engaging if we stayed on topic and stayed on continuing to talk about the stuff that we did talk about for those episodes. But there are certain excerpts from previous episodes where if you listen to them on their own, they are still pretty engaging. So this episode is essentially a compilation of those. And to begin, we have several minutes of cut content from the Dylan Matthews episode, where Dylan spends some time giving some interesting answers about both negativity bias and some other stuff like his views on capital gains tax policy in the US. Hope you enjoy.
Yeah, I think there's a huge negativity bias in media. There was a great Margot Singer-Katz for the Upshot had an amazing piece on sort of bending the cost curve in Medicare that I think deservedly got lots of attention. But those pieces are the exception. People like to focus on the problems. I was reading some of the sort of early history of Medicaid. There's a great book by Jonathan Engel called Poor People's Medicine that tells sort of the story of Medicaid over many years. And one of the points it makes, which is sort of like duh when you hear it, but hadn't really occurred to me before, was part of why you started seeing health insurance plans crop up at the beginning of the 20th century is that like medicine started working kind of like we'd always had medicine and we had surgeons, but like we didn't have widespread antibiotics until the 30s and 40s. The polio vaccine, the first like really successful one, was late 40s, early 50s. Chemotherapy and other treatments for cancer was a post-war development. Sort of a lot of transplant surgeries weren't conducted at all until the 1950s. The first kidney transplant happened then. Just there was not like a lot of expensive things for doctors to do for like the first century of American history. And like the healthcare now is like this incredibly knotty and complex issue, but it costs so much money and is such a vital issue because like we just like came up with these solutions to problems that previously just like didn't have solutions. If you got cancer, you died, and like that was it. And so I think they're in some ways a testament to our success and ways in which the possibilities of American life have become brighter.
How has knowledge of negativity bias like affected your own coverage? Like, do you ever like try to stop yourself and try to find ways to like frame the issues that you write about in a way that like keeps people more informed about the ways that the world is getting better, and maybe like gives them like a sense of optimism about the whole, like us trying to deal with a lot of these problems?
I think it's mostly affected me in terms of topic selection, that I try to look for stories that have more positive upshots. And I'm lucky in that I have sort of funding and sort of an institutional arrangement where I can I can do that without as much fear about losing readership. I sort of worry that teaching more journalists about negativity bias is just sort of like giving an instruction manual for how to like hit that button even harder and get more attention by framing things increasingly negatively.
Final question. So like, I guess this is inspired by your like belief in the effective altruist cause. Let's say that someone won the lottery and now they suddenly have like $100,000 that they want to like give to charitable causes, but they don't know where to start. Where would you recommend that they donate their money?
So I think I feel like it would be out of line for me to give advice other than what I do. And I donate 10% of my salary to GiveWell's top charities every month. And those top charities, I think GiveWell as an institution keeps track of whether, you know, the vitamin A supplementation program to prevent blindness and other health problems in sub-Saharan Africa, whether they need more money, or whether the bed nets people need more money, or whether the malaria prevention through pills people need more money. I kind of outsource the decision on where the best place to fill in funding gaps is to GiveWell. And I think at the $100,000 level, that's it probably still makes sense to be doing that kind of outsourcing. I am not giving $100,000 a year, maybe over 10 years. But I think this is a situation where there are people whose entire job is trying to find optimal uses for money, and I think GiveWell does a great job. If you care less about sort of global health, there are great groups working on animal welfare. There are good groups working on catastrophic risks like nuclear or AI, if you're into that kind of thing. But I think GiveWell is sort of the dumb first Google answer, and I think it's still a very good answer, and it's what I use, in part because I think it's a very good service, and in part because I write about charities enough that it feels sort of like investing in an index fund, that it's sort of a way to avoid being personally entangled with a specific charity that I might write about.
Yeah, wait, actually, I think that gave me like an idea for like a very last, like just to like bounce to one last thread before leaving.
Sure.
Do you think that the U.S.'s capital gains tax is too high, too low, or something else?
I think your capital gains tax is probably too low, but more importantly, it's badly structured. I think the unrealized gains tax that has caused so much controversy recently, which I think is an okay idea that would probably be struck down by the Supreme Court, but it's in part a response to like real weaknesses in the way the capital gains tax is designed now. I'll just focus on one because it's egregious and it's a fucking scandal that everyone should be outraged about. If Mark Zuckerberg dies and leaves his Facebook stock to his children, those children will not have to pay tax on the amount that the Facebook stock gained in value in Mark Zuckerberg's life. They will not have to pay tax on all those billions. They'll pay a state tax on it. But if they sell, they only sell on the difference between the sales price and the value when they inherited it. So it's quite possible that they could sell and suddenly have billions and billions of dollars and not pay a dime in income tax. And they might pay a state tax, but that's fairly easy to game and they have good lawyers. The thing where you can just by dying wipe out all your tax burden on billions in wealth is completely outrageous. And if you're looking at places to raise revenue to deal with the debt problem, that should be place number one.
Next up, I have some cut content from my interview with Regan Arntz-Gray, the feminist Substack writer that I spent over an hour opening cans of worms with over and over again, whether it be with feminism or gender differences or social constructionism and more. Because when I say more, but it's because we have like an additional, like, give or take 10 minutes of us talking about additional topics that I'm about to bring to you right now, including her history as a Catholic, how that affected her views on gender, and what she thinks about trad culture. Hope you enjoy.
Could you talk about your history as a Catholic and, like, A, why you were originally a Catholic, B, what changed your mind, and C, like, the extent to which that may have affected your views on gender?
Yes. So I'm Canadian. I'm from Ontario. So one thing that's relevant to this is that in Ontario, or in Canada in general, we have two public school systems. We have the secular public school system and we have the Catholic public school system. So the point is that even if you're not religious at all, even if you're not from even if you're from like a Christmas, Easter Catholic family, you'll go to the Catholic school and you'll get that training, even if your family is not particularly religiously conservative. So I was in Catholic school from, junior kindergarten through grade 12. It was not a particularly religious environment by any means. Most people were, religion was just kind of in the background, but you have religion class, you go to mass every month, you do first communion and confirmation together and all of that. And, you get the Catholic sex ed as well, which is abstinence based and definitely had some gender things around, women being used pieces of gum if they have sex too early and nobody wants to use a piece of gum. Stuff like that. The stuff you see in movies that I'm like, wow, I can't believe they actually taught us that, but they did. So that being said, for me, feminism was like always a pretty live thing because my mom was she identified as a feminist. My dad, I think, would even identify as a feminist. Like they both took each other's names. And so I grew up in a super, super gender equal household and with, my mom and I both being in some ways gender nonconforming in terms of not being very agreeable and things like that.
Especially by Ontario standards.
And then also I was always like more quantitatively strong and my mom was too. So I'm kind of just trying to give you a picture of like putting aside the Catholicism for a second, just my family dynamic, it made social constructionism seem very, very likely to me because the women I was around, right, were did not seem to be particularly demure or anything like that. But yeah, I guess I would say that the main gendered reality that I got from the Catholic education, which was not coming from sort of my social dynamics otherwise or my familial norms, was around the importance of purity for women. I think that a lot of trads are too comfortable with going back to that and don't really recognize the harm it
Could you
causes.
give like a 2-sentence description of what trads are?
Trads are essentially people who think that men and women having significantly different gender roles is a good thing, that we in the past, when, you know, a lot of the times they seem to be sort of talking about like 1950s upper middle class white family dynamics where a woman was primarily being the domestic caretaker and the man was sort of making money. And they just essentially believe that that's a better norm for both men and women, that people are more fulfilled, are happier, etc. And I think that can be true. I think that can be a great way of splitting work. Like, you know, especially if you have the ability to afford it and, you know, one of you wants to stay home, I think it's going to be naturally more likely that the woman wants to do that. That does not in any way say that the woman is, you know, being forced into that role. But I think like the trad ideology, I do think is just like I think it's just really bad to like partner up with somebody on the basis of strict ideology like that. Like you want to be responsive to reality. And like, if you go into it saying this is men's work and this is women's work, even if that's, you know, even if you would say like society on average will be structured in this way just naturally, and that's better for men and women, and we don't need to try to change it. That's totally fine. But like we've been talking about this whole conversation, while we recognize that there's average sex differences, there's also so much variability. And like, if your husband's a good cook, just let him be the cook then. Like, there's no point in saying, I'm going to do this because somebody said 50 years ago that this was more the women's work than the man's work. So trads are generally, there's different extremities of them. Like, some people just want to live a more traditional lifestyle for themselves where they have very clearly defined roles, and the women are focused on kids and household and the man is focused on making money and protecting, providing. I think that's totally fine on an individual level, although I think rigid ideologies with respect to relationships are probably not helpful to keeping relationships flourishing long term. But they also go way more extreme where they're like, we should take away women's right to vote and there should be a family vote, and that's how it was before. And like, women were not actually, you know, the deal for women pre-sexual revolution, and, you know, some of them say pre the 19th Amendment, were better off than they are now. And feminism has actually just made life worse for both women and men. Sorry, that was not 2 sentences. I'm trying to collapse a broad concept into something explainable, but hopefully I got the essence of it. But yeah, I do think that when it comes to sexual purity, the trad people are really okay with shaming, slut shaming and stuff like that. And one of the things that I've realized when I've talked to these people online is that the reason sometimes we're totally talking past each other because they don't actually see shaming someone as a big negative cost. Whereas I think shaming someone and making them feel terrible is a real harm that you've done to them.
They see it as like promoting a virtuous society.
They see it as promoting a virtuous society, and they actually just like, I think that, you know, if your assumption is that sort of like positive conscious experiences or feeling good about yourself and whatever are the thing you want to maximize for a person, versus I think the trad perspective is much more like sociological. They're like, no, the thing we want to promote is sort of reproduction and stability, and there's a lot less concern about the emotional life of the individual. It is I think they tend to be less individualistic, so that's part of it. But like, and I've talked about this with people, around fat shaming as well. Like I wrote about, why I think fat shaming is bad, which is not to say that I think there's no problems with the health at every size movement and other things like that. But a lot of it comes down to whether people think the psychological cost of feeling shame is something that you want to minimize, all else equal, or if they think it's kind of this like free option where if you can shame people and it gives you a result you want, it's all positive no matter what. Whereas to me, I'm like, the shame has to be worth, you have to get a good enough benefit from the shame for it to be worth the shame. So like with cigarettes, I feel like lowering lung cancer, shaming something that isn't really that great anyway, that seems like a decent trade where we should use shame. When it comes to sexuality, I just think the harms of shaming people's sexuality are actually really, really great. And I think they kind of follow through a bunch of other pathologies that like show up in other areas of your life. And I think it's actually really bad. So to me, I'm like, simply lowering the amount of casual sex is not a goal that's worth like really shaming people. If you can give like, that's not to say that we don't need to be concerned about like marriage rates or abortion rates or anything else.
Or fertility rates and so on and so forth.
Or fertility rates for sure. But it's like, it is really interesting because when I talk to them, I realized, we're just not making common ground at all because they don't even agree that making someone feel really negative emotions is a cost that we have to worry about.
Next up is by far the largest excerpt of cut content from an episode, which in this case is cut content from my most recent interview with Jamie Weinstein from The Dispatch. Now, if you remember, there was a part from that episode where I was asking him if he thought that there were any issues with the Democratic Party that were comparable to the issues within the Republican Party right now. And most of that answer made it into the final cut. The one thing that didn't make it into the final cut was the part where he started talking about Israel-Palestine. Now, I'm going to begin this section by preferencing something that I also make sure to acknowledge within the audio itself, which is that Israel-Palestine is not an issue, it is not a hill that I would be willing to die under. It is not an issue that I am an expert in. It is an issue that I have done only like a decent amount of research in. But once again, do not take anything that I say as like something that you would hear from an expert, but just someone who is casually interested in this topic. And so I ask a bunch of questions, and regardless of what you think of those questions, I do think that it does do a pretty good job of illuminating the guest's views on Israel-Palestine. But yeah, one more thing to keep in mind is that this part of the interview was recorded weeks ago and shortly before Sinwar's death, which is why we don't mention it in the episode. But yeah, I hope you enjoy it. Do you think there are any problems within the Democratic Party that are even remotely comparable to the dangerous threat that Donald Trump and his ilk pose to the country?
No, I would say that as I said, the number one threat is preserving democracy. The second issue in my mind is kind of this issue of wokeism again, in order to and I do think that has a large prominence within. I think more people would agree with those issues within the Democratic media establishment. Like, and when I say, I know I'm not like loosely saying CNN or I mean literally the left of center media, but also probably some of the mainstream media that leans left. Then and on Twitter, then within the Democratic Party at large. So I do think that it's an issue within more of elite Democratic circles than maybe the Democratic people, ordinary people who describe themselves as Democratic. I still think that's an issue.
Yeah, and I guess we would both agree that like it is nowhere near as bad as the problem that Donald Trump poses. But I guess when
Donald Trump is the more imminent problem. But I do think it's a very big problem. I don't want to minimize it. I think like when you see, this is where we might disagree. When you have masses of students effectively or demonstrably having protests on campus in favor of Hamas, you have to ask what went wrong. and that's and I can see that you might disagree with that, but
No, it's just like I've spent so long like avoiding Israel-Palestine, and now I feel like I like
gravitational pull. But
yeah.
there's a guy at Columbia who led the movement there, who first apologized and didn't apologize. He like is effective. They effectively saying he supports Hamas. So I mean, not
Yeah.
effectively, like blatantly. So I do think that's but that's interesting. So not to get into your views on Israel, Palestine, or Hamas and whatnot. I think that is a very major problem if you come from where I think of on these issues, a very major problem and a very major signal that there is a problem within uh, uh, I don't know if you say the Democratic Party or uh, uh, the left or what have you. So I do think that's a major signal.
Yeah. All right, so I think I'll lay like a few things down. So the first thing is that like Israel-Palestine is not a hill that I would be willing to die under. So I think what I would say is that I have some like low confidence, high significance disagreement with you, if that makes sense. Where like I like naturally gravitate to like very different positions than you, but like it's not something that I say like where I think that I'm an expert. It's just something where like I've done some like a decent amount of research, but I'm open to changing my mind. Um,
I would
so
say, yeah, I
go
would say
ahead.
that a day after the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, people are already saying that Israel is committing a genocide literally within a week. I mean, I think Bill Ayers, I had him on, and I found tweets within a week. He's tweeting that there's a genocide going on in Gaza.
For the record, I enjoyed your interview with Bill Ayers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, yeah, I've had a few of them, but and then students on campus almost immediately not protesting Hamas. Some of them openly supporting Hamas. Man, that's a really negative signal. I mean, especially if people have any idea of what Hamas is. And it's a worldview that comes from what I think is being taught in a lot of academic programs on campus. And that worldview, some people describe as the oppressor oppress kind of ideology, but it kind of, I think it's affected large swaths of elite academia, and it's penetrating down into schools, I think, starting at the earliest ages. Again, when the culture war came for the kids is not about Israel-Palestine, I think, at all, but I think it demonstrates the issue that's starting at a very young age and is a very serious problem if you're having kids grow up being indoctrinated with what I think is lunacy.
All right, I guess I agree with you that Hamas is bad and college support for Hamas is bad, and I think that should be rejected. So I guess could you elaborate a little bit more on like what your views on Israel-Palestine are? Yeah, like screw it. I'm just gonna ask for your opinion on this. Yeah.
It's probably the one area I know most about, just because I've studied this for most of my adult life. My master's thesis at LSE was dealt with a part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, I don't know. My view is that no one is perfect. I can point to a lot of things that Israel has done that is imperfect, but there is no comparison between the society that Israel has created and what Israel has done versus what is going on and the attacks against them. And I believe that there have been opportunities for peace repeatedly that have been rejected by the Palestinian Arab side. It's very broad, but I'm happy to answer anything in specific you'd like.
All right. So this is an area where I personally don't feel like comfortable arguing with you, but I know that I have
Sure.
tons of friends that have strong views. So I think what I'll do is I'll just like ask you to elaborate on your opinion and like try to pick out the finer details and then just
Sure.
leave it at that.
Sure.
So do you think that anti-Semitism has been on the rise?
Yes. On the right and the left.
All right. So I guess I'm going to ask you some questions that I've heard of, like regarding like criticisms of Israel, and then I'm going to ask you if you would consider them to be anti-Semitism. So, like, would you consider anti-Zionism to be a form of anti-Semitism?
Almost always, but not always.
So, like 80 or 90% of the time.
Yes.
All right. So I'm
There,
gonna.
there are anti-Zionist Jews, not many, but there are. I mean, and there are people that might sincerely be anti-Zionist, but I think the circle's nearly complete. I mean, yeah, I would say it's a pretty good signal that someone doesn't like Jewish people.
All right. So I'm gonna list off some like criticisms that I've heard of Israel, and I want you to let me know if you think you consider it anti-Semitism.
You know, but I don't like the anti-Semitism thing because I really don't. I like to like take someone, even if I think their position is anti-Semitic, and just engage with them on the specific point that they make.
So
But I mean, so I mean, I'd rather have you know, I'm reticent to go around calling people anti-Semitic. I have occasionally when I think it's pretty clear, but um, I'd rather just have engage in the issue because I don't think they can win the argument.
all
Uh,
right. How about
but
I'll just state the position and then you let
sure,
me know what you think of the position.
sure.
Number one, the West Bank is an apartheid state. What do you think of that position?
The West Bank is a semi-sovereign area that the Palestinians want to turn into a state of their own, and that Israel has repeatedly tried to offer them deals and where it could be a state. The West Bank is not in Israel. They're not Israelis. So, I mean, I don't. They're not. They don't want to be under Israeli law. They don't want to be governed by Israel. So, no, I don't think it's apartheid state. I think it doesn't make any sense. I don't even. I'm trying to even understand how someone could consider it an apartheid state.
I guess the argument that I would hear from them would be like they would say that like Palestinians are discriminated against and treated as second-class citizens compared to Israelis.
So the difference is that you're talking about Israeli Arabs within Israel. So
Well, let's start
so
with the West Bank. Okay.
they're not Israeli citizens, and they don't want to be, and they have their own government. I mean, Yasser Arafat ruled over it was a semi-sovereign government. Mahmoud Abbas runs a semi-sovereign government. They have elections there. I don't even get the argument that they want to be their own state. Israel, with Oslo separated the territories. They live within the West Bank, and Jews don't live in the West Bank. In fact, to be honest with you, the only apartheid that may exist, or would even be apartheid, would be if the Palestinians had a state in the West Bank. I asked the ambassador at the time from Palestine, the PLO actually, to Israel in the United States at a breakfast, would a Jew be allowed to live in the West Bank if there was a state? And he said no. Um, uh, Many Muslims, many Arabs live in Israel and have equal rights, other than they're not forced to serve in the military, and therefore some of the rights that go with serving in the military don't come automatically. But that's kind of obvious. They don't. Why you wouldn't force a Palestinian Arab living in Israel to serve in the military? They have the option.
So do you believe that Palestinians in the West Bank are given like full autonomy?
No, they've rejected autonomy, and they wouldn't get full autonomy in any. So they wouldn't get Israel has legitimate concerns about security, but they have been offered a state many times in most, like 97% of the West Bank, with land swaps making up the rest. They rejected it time and time again. At Camp David, the Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar, told Yasser Arafat that would be a crime if you rejected the deal that was on the table. And
So just to be clear, do you believe that Palestinians were mainly responsible for the fallout of Camp David?
yes.
Okay. I'm gonna make some more statements and I want you to let me know what you think of those like positions. So like, let's say that I were to say Israel is responsible for far more Palestinian civilian casualties than Palestine is responsible for Israeli civilian
In the
casualties.
terms of numbers that have died, there are more Palestinians who have died in the conflict than Israelis. That is a factual statement. But that is not that is a statement that doesn't really tell you all that much. Uh, you know, more Nazis died than American soldiers in World War II. That doesn't tell you what side is good and what side is bad. I think the question is the objective.
Well, I'm not talking about soldiers, I'm talking about civilians. Would you agree that the civilian death toll in Palestine is like for Palestinians is greater than the civilian death toll for Israelis?
Yes.
Yeah.
But
So
again,
go ahead.
I mean, it's a matter of intent, right? If Hamas or the Palestinian Authority under Yasser Arafat, but especially Hamas, had the ability to kill, and Israel was weak, there would be massacres of civilians, as we saw on October 7th. Israel, to the extent that Palestinian civilians die, it is because they are going after military targets, often military targets that are embedding under civilian population. And that is the difference.
Yeah. But then what would you say to someone who might rebut that by saying that the US's foreign policy establishment during the war on terror took far more care to prevent civilian deaths than the Israel state currently is?
I would say that is not what the position of as far as I can tell, the world's greatest expert on urban warfare at West Point. Richard, not Richard Spencer, that's the bad guy. John Spencer, who was on the Dispatch podcast as well. And I don't think actually anyone's really in a position to evaluate, the ratio of civilian deaths to military deaths or yet, because I don't think we have an accurate accounting. But according to John Spencer, Israel has taken more precautions than maybe any army ever in the history of urban warfare.
Like of all time.
John Spencer. Are you familiar with John Spencer?
No, I'm not familiar with John Spencer. Yeah.
He runs West Point's urban warfare studies department. He wrote a book called History of Urban Warfare. As far as I can tell, he's the main scholar on urban warfare in the world.
Yeah.
And that's what he's written.
Maybe I should get him on sometime. All right. Next statement. Let's say I were to say the state of Israel treats Palestinians like second-class citizens within Israel. What would you say to that?
I would say probably it's imperfect, just like in the US, it's imperfect between some races. But in terms of rights, I think Palestinian Arabs have pretty much all the rights that Israelis have, with the exception of they're not forced to serve in the military, and that comes with some benefits. And certainly, Israeli Arabs have more rights than any other Arab group anywhere in the Middle East.
Wait, are you talking about rights, or are you talking about living conditions?
Rights.
Okay. Because I think when people make use living conditions as an argument, that has the potential to be problematic. Because in the same vein, you could argue that you could theoretically someone, if they wanted to, back in the 50s, they could defend Jim Crow America by saying that Black Americans had a better standard of living than some comparable third world country.
No, more rights.
Right.
Are you familiar with any Arabs who can vote for their leaders? Are many Arab countries that can vote for their leaders?
So are you saying that Israel is the only place where Arabs can vote for their leaders?
I guess Iraq now you can. I mean, there's not many in the Arab world where you can vote for your leaders. There's not many where there's a Supreme Court that is prescribed within law, or at least that has often sided upon the sides of Arabs against Israelis, where an Arab has served on the Supreme Court. I mean, I guess that's an example. Is there any Arab that serves on a real Supreme Court anywhere in the Arab world?
So yeah, this is meant as a rhetorical question to show that Israel is giving Arabs more rights than elsewhere.
No, I think I made two statements. One is that Israel domestically has its problems like every other democracy in the world. Everywhere in Europe, you can point to issues within uh, 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 society. But in terms of rights given to the citizens, Arabs and Israelis, Palestinian Arabs and Israelis have the same rights, other than that uh, Arab Israelis aren't forced to serve in the military, though some choose to do. And then I made a second statement, which is that Palestinian Arabs have more rights than any of the other Arabs all in the entire Middle East, in the entire Arab world. And I think that's hard to question.
All right, next statement. Let's say that I were to say something like, "Oh, Israel's racist and expansionist policies suggest that it was doomed as an idea." Would you like what would you say to that? Like if someone were to make that argument, what would you say?
I would ask them to explain the expansionist policies
What do you think of the
or the racist
settlers?
policies.
What do you think of the settlers?
I think that the government should have taken a more protracted element to dismantle illegal settlements. But in terms of expansion,
Well, okay,
you know,
so what would you say to someone who might rebut that, or at least like try to rebut that by saying that like the Israeli government was trying to have some level of plausibility to like plausible deniability in terms of secretly supporting the settlements?
sure.
Like,
So, well, I'd want to go to the expansionist element before and say, if Israel was truly expansionist, why would they have given back the Sinai, which was like 3 times the amount that was like the biggest amount of territory which they won after the 6 Day War? So, I mean, they would have kept the Sinai. There's no question that Israel's happy that it has Jerusalem now, but how did they get Jerusalem? It was the 6 Day War, where 2 messages were sent to King Abdullah of Jordan at the time, King Hussein at the time of Jordan at the time, not to engage in the fight, and they did, and they lost territory in a war that the Arabs thrust upon Israel. I mean, that's not expansionist. That was a defensive war that they engaged in and won territory, and then tried to give a lot of it back. But what happened after the 6 Day War? The Arab world, the Arab League, met in Khartoum and issued the 3 no's: no negotiations with Israel, no peace with Israel, and no. I forgot the third no. But why are you laughing?
no, it's like I've spent so much time trying to avoid Israel-Palestine, and now I'm just arguing like, yeah. Just
So
keep going.
I would say that most of the expansion that Israel has gotten, some of it that doesn't want Gaza, never wanted Gaza, ultimately gave back Gaza in 2005. Didn't want the Sinai, gave back the Sinai in the Camp David Accords, and tried to give back most of the West Bank. So
yeah, sorry. Yeah. Next statement. Let's say that I were to say Israel is a rogue state that has been violating the Geneva Conventions for several decades. Like if someone were to say that, what would you think of that position?
I'm not an international lawyer. I'm almost certain that it's not true. So that's what I would say.
All right. Do you oppose a two-state solution?
No, I support it. I do wonder, though, that those who support a 2 state solution ever ask what kind of state would be the second state. It's not going to be a free and liberal democratic society that we come to know. I think we're farther away after October 7th from a 2 state solution than we've been in a long time. But in theory, I've always supported it and wished. I wish the Palestinian Arabs would have accepted it the many times that Israel offered it to them.
Do you think there is a tendency among Israeli Jews to like wish that like Palestinians could and should be treated like second-class citizens?
So Israel is a pretty diverse society. I'm sure that some people wish that. Um,
Do you think Ben Gvir wishes that? What do you think? What do you think he wants?
I think it would be very hard to find very many supporters of Ben Gvir, not only in the United States.
But he's part
But
of Netanyahu's cabinet.
let
Like,
me
how did
finish.
that happen? Go ahead.
I can explain that. Very hard to find supporters of Ben Gvir, not only in the United States, but in Israel. Because the nature of the way the Israeli system works is that have to have a coalition government. So he, I think, I mean, what's his party? His maybe one or two people in the Knesset. But because the votes are so close, in order to scrape together a coalition, Netanyahu needed two or one person in order to get the coalition. I didn't like it. I never thought he should do it. I thought he should come to some terms with some of his political opponents. But in order to create a government, he needed to bring it in. It's the unfortunate nature of coalition governments. I wish he would find a different coalition. But the idea that Ben Gvir is some popular figure in Israel, that he has lots of support, put it this way, Bernie Sanders probably has, as a percentage of the population supporting him in the United States, much, much, much more support than Ben Gvir. He's a very marginal figure who's unfortunately, because of coalition government, given much more power than he should ever, ever, ever have.
Would you oppose a Palestinian right of return?
To Israel?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that would just end Israel's. No, that's it's an absurdity. Yeah, of course, I would oppose that, and all the Palestinians leaders know that's an impossibility.
So you would oppose a two-state solution if, like, part of the parameters were a Palestinian right of return?
To Israel proper?
Yes.
You would end Israel. I mean, that's like, I'm trying to think. It's like you oppose sharing your two donuts with me if I get to have all the donut, your donut as well. I mean, if you created a Palestinian right of return, you'd be opening up the possibility of the end of Israel. You're basically ensuring the possibility of the end of Israel.
And why is that
why would anyone,
like why would a Palestinian right of return lead to the end of Israel?
as a Jewish state?
Yes.
Because you would have a majority non-Jewish population within Israel. You would have two Palestinian states.
Okay. I guess my last question on Israel-Palestine would be, like, how badly would Israel have to conduct the war in order for you to lose faith in the way they are conducting the war?
I just told you that the head of urban studies at West Point thinks not only are they not conducting the war badly.
Yeah, no. So, like, my question is, like, how badly would it have to go? Like, what how badly would the hypothetical have to go in order for you to, like, lose faith in them and, like, for example, support a ceasefire?
Yeah. So I guess there's two things. So how do you define badly? Badly could mean you're not achieving your victory, and badly could also mean that you're conducting the war immorally.
All right, let's do the second one. Let's think about the second one. Yeah.
They would have to conduct the war immorally, and I don't believe they are. So
yeah, but, like, how immorally? Like what numbers would you consider to be immoral? Like, what?
I don't. Again, like, numbers. How do you numbers? Obviously you want to reduce civilian casualties to as much as possible, and we don't even know how many civilian casualties there are. So, I mean, I wouldn't judge it by numbers. I would, if they're carpet bombing cities, yeah, that would be really bad. They're not doing that, and I don't even think anyone.
If they were okay, let's say they would, like, let's imagine a hypothetical where they were, like, bulldozing over cities and like basically just, like, mowing down, like destroying buildings in order to destroy Hamas.
I don't know why the hypothetical, if they're going after Hamas, who is hiding under buildings.
Yeah, so, like, let's say, like,
target.
Would you accept a hypothetical where, like, they had to kill 20 civilians to kill one Hamas terrorist? Like, would you accept that?
No, and I don't think they're doing that. And I mean, I guess the question would be, in that scenario, and you'd have to ask an international law expert, would be proportionality. If the Hamas terrorist in question is, or let's say it was the Nazis, if it was Hitler, and by killing Hitler, you would end the war, international experts might say that's a legitimate target to target. So
do you think they've been successfully ending the war?
To answer you, yes. I think you're on the verge, potentially, and there's still ways to go, of Israel creating a the safest environment that it's ever had. Defeating and dismantling Hezbollah in Lebanon, defeating and dismantling Hamas, and potentially, if it goes for it, delaying greatly Iran's nuclear program. And then the great threats to Israel would be mitigated significantly.
All right,
So yes, the answer is yes.
I'm done on Israel-Palestine. That's as far as I want to go.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.